The wind, a cold, indifferent sculptor, carved a mournful howl through the high pines. For Caleb Stone, it was the sound of solitude, a constant companion in the isolated cabin he had built with his own two hands. He lived by the rhythm of the seasons, his days a quiet meditation of chopping wood, hunting deer, and watching the sunset over the distant peaks of the Rockies. His face, etched with a decade of silence and weathered by a relentless sun, held a permanent expression of weary vigilance, a shadow of the man he once was. His home was a testament to his self-imposed exile. The cabin, built from timber he'd felled himself, was solid, practical, and devoid of comforts. Inside, a single wood stove provided a meager warmth, casting a flickering light across the walls lined with hunting trophies and survival gear. On a worn table sat a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with nothing but dates and the names of the men he had once led. He hadn't written a word in it in years. A frayed scar, a white lightning bolt across his left eyebrow, was the only physical mark of his past life as a special forces operator. The deeper scars were invisible, buried beneath layers of self-imposed exile. He'd seen too much, done too much, and in the end, lost too much. The memory of the botched extraction in Kandahar was a constant, haunting film loop in his mind. He could still feel the dust in his throat, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the desperate, guttural cries of a man left behind. It was a failure that ended his career and shattered his unit, a wound that had never truly healed. One evening, as he meticulously cleaned his rifle on the porch, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the oiled cloth against cold steel was broken by an alien sound. It was a distant grinding rumble, the growl of a heavy engine struggling up the logging road. Caleb's posture went rigid, his hand instinctively gripping the rifle stock. He hadn't had a visitor in 4 years. The air, once filled with the peaceful whisper of the wind, now felt thick with an unwelcome tension. He watched as a mud-caked Ford F-150, its suspension groaning with every rut in the road, lumbered to a halt in the clearing. The engine fell silent, and in the sudden vacuum of sound, Caleb's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The truck door opened, and out stepped a man he knew, a man he had spent 10 years trying to forget. Marcus Thorne looked older, his face lined with a fatigue that had nothing to do with age. He wore a city-bought tactical jacket that looked out of place, and his eyes, searching and desperate, were an open book of fear. As he took a hesitant step forward, he raised his hands in a placating gesture, as if approaching a wild animal. "Sergeant Stone," Thorne said, his voice a strained whisper, as if he feared being overheard by the silent trees. "We need to talk." Caleb didn't lower his rifle. He simply stared, his eyes narrowed, devoid of welcome. The memory of Thorne's face, pale and panicked as he gave the order to retreat in Kandahar, flashed in his mind. "You're trespassing, Thorne." His voice was a low growl, rusty from disuse. Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took another step, the gravel crunching under his boots like a series of small, sharp gunshots. "Caleb, please." His hands, Caleb noticed, were trembling. Not a little, but a deep, constant tremor that spoke of an exhaustion far beyond physical weariness. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his cheeks stood out. "It's about Kandahar. He's back." The name hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. A flicker of a long-dormant fear, a ghost of the man who had ordered the fateful mission, passed through Caleb's eyes. He didn't betray it with a single muscle twitch, but inside, a frozen part of him began to thaw, a cold dread seeping into his bones. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Thorne's practiced calm completely unraveled. He gestured wildly towards the forest, his arms shaking uncontrollably. The fear in his eyes was raw, unmasked, and terrifyingly real. The asset, the one we left for dead. He's back, and he's killing us. Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened, his knuckles turning white. The name, the Asset, was a curse word from his past. He remembered the reports, the intelligence, the ruthless efficiency of their target. He had always been a ghost, a myth, a master of deception. The thought of him being alive, of him walking the earth 10 years later, was a cold shock that sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. Thorne's desperate, trembling face confirmed it. The past, a grave Caleb had tried to dig for himself, was no longer a grave. It was a battlefield, and the first shot had just been fired. The cabin, a sanctuary of 10 years of solitude, was now an interrogation room. The old wood stove crackled, but the warmth did nothing to dispel the cold tension that filled the air. Marcus Thorne, now slumped in a chair across from Caleb, looked like a man on the verge of shattering. His city-bought tactical jacket was too hot for the room, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and he kept running a hand through his thinning hair. Caleb, in stark contrast, was an island of stillness. He sat at the rough-hewn table, a map of the world spread between them, a familiar rifle in his hands. He continued his ritualistic cleaning, the oiled cloth a constant rhythmic distraction from the frantic energy radiating from Thorne. "They were close, Caleb," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at the map, tracing a line from a small town in Arizona to a cabin in rural Idaho. Sanchez, our sniper. He was a quiet guy, a family man now, lived off the grid. They found him. His throat slit. It was clean, surgical, no signs of a struggle. He never even saw it coming. Thorne's hand hovered over the map, trembling uncontrollably. Just like Kandahar. Caleb's jaw tightened. He remembered Sanchez, a ghost in the hills, a hawk with a rifle. He was the best shot in their unit. To be taken out like that, silently, brutally, it spoke of a hunter far more skilled, a predator who knew their every move. Thorne's finger moved to another point on the map, a quiet suburb in Ohio. Ramirez, the medic, he was running a private clinic. He was a good guy, helped a lot of people. Thorne's voice dropped to a near whisper, laced with genuine grief. He was stabbed multiple times. We think he fought back, but he didn't stand a chance. A single tear traced a path down Thorne's cheek, a betrayal of the practiced calm he had tried to maintain. The CO found a note on his chest, said, "One by one, like you did to me." The words hung in the air, a poisonous, bitter accusation. Caleb finally stopped cleaning his rifle. He laid it flat on the table, its cold steel a silent anchor in the storm of Thorne's fear. Caleb remembered the extraction, the panicked retreat, the explosion, the call to pull out and leave the asset behind after he was presumed dead. It was his call. The weight of that decision had never left him, a phantom limb he was forced to carry every day. "Why come to me?" Caleb finally asked, his gaze fixed on the rifle, not on Thorne. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a man speaking from a great distance. "I'm out. I'm a ghost myself." Thorne's face crumpled, a genuine, raw anguish breaking through his facade. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table, a desperate supplicant. "Because you're the only one who can stop him. You knew him better than any of us. You were the only one he couldn't surprise." His eyes, wide and pleading, finally met Caleb's. "He was always watching you, Caleb. He had a kind of respect for you. He was obsessed with your tactical style. He knew you were the mind behind the operations, the one giving the orders." Thorne's voice dropped, becoming a desperate plea. "Caleb, please. Our CO, Captain Miller, he's next. He's out of the game too. He's old, he's tired. We've got to warn him. You're the only one who can stop this. You're the only one he's afraid of." Thorne's words were a last desperate gamble, a Hail Mary pass into the cold, impenetrable silence of the man who sat before him. Caleb's jaw tightened. He finally looked up from his rifle, his eyes meeting Thorne's with a cold, hard finality. His eyes, usually dead and empty, now held a deep, simmering anger, a reflection of the guilt he had buried for so long. "You shouldn't have come here." The words weren't a suggestion. They were a statement of fact, a grim prophecy. Thorne's face fell, the last of his hope draining from him. He knew what Caleb meant. By coming to the hermit, he had not only brought the past back, he had brought the hunter with it. He had chained Caleb to the war again, and by doing so, he had sealed his own fate. Caleb stood on the porch, watching the taillights of Thorne's truck disappear down the winding dirt road. The sound of the engine faded into the night, leaving a silence that felt heavier, more menacing than before. A part of him, the part that had spent a decade seeking peace and solitude, wanted to let the past die. He could stay here, in his cabin, and let the hunter and the hunted consume each other. But another part, a deeply buried sense of duty and guilt, was screaming. The faces of Sanchez and Ramirez, men he had trained with, laughed with, and fought beside, flashed in his mind. He knew this wasn't just about revenge. It was about the ghosts that haunted them all. It was about the price of command, the weight of a decision made in a moment of panicked retreat. He walked back inside, the scent of wood smoke and old leather a stark contrast to the scent of gasoline and fear that Thorne had brought in. He didn't waste time. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, the old soldier resurfacing from beneath the hermit's quiet calm. He packed a bag with the essentials, a change of clothes, some dried meat, a compass, and his hunting knife. Each item was a deliberate choice, a part of a forgotten ritual. His rifle, now clean and oiled, was his only true companion now, a familiar weight in his hands. He couldn't go to the authorities. Their unit was a black ops team, and their Kandahar mission was a classified skeleton in the military's closet. This was their fight, and his alone. His destination was a small town in Oregon, where their former captain, a man named Miller, now ran a small, struggling hardware store. Caleb's drive was silent, the engine of his old pickup a steady, low hum that was the only sound for hundreds of miles. His mind, once a quiet, still lake, was now a battlefield of memories and tactical planning. He replayed the Kandahar mission, searching for clues for a weakness he might have missed. He was no longer the hermit of Copper Creek. He was a soldier on a new mission. The sun was high in the sky when he finally drove into the small town of Hope, Oregon. The name of the town felt like a cruel joke. He parked his truck on the main street, a row of tired, single-story buildings. His eyes, now sharper, were scanning, assessing, looking for the telltale signs of a man living on borrowed time. When he found the hardware store, Miller's Hardware, the bell above the door jingled mournfully as he pushed it open. Captain Miller, a man now riddled with arthritis and a gentle, resigned expression, looked up from behind the counter. The years had not been kind. His once straight back was now slightly stooped. His hands, once powerful and steady, were now gnarled with age. He saw Caleb, a figure from a past he had tried to bury, and his weathered face broke into a sad, knowing smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up, son," he said, his voice raspy and low, filled with a mixture of resignation and relief. "Marcus called. He said the wolf is at the door." Caleb's gaze was sharp, scanning the quiet store for any signs of danger. He saw the fire extinguisher, the emergency exits, the shotgun propped behind the counter. Miller, he realized, was not as retired as he seemed. "He's not a wolf, sir," Caleb said, his voice flat, his eyes meeting Miller's with a cold intensity. "He's a ghost, and he's coming for us all." Miller's smile faded. He leaned against the counter, his old bones creaking with the effort. "I know, Caleb. I knew the moment Marcus called. I knew he was coming for us." He looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "Marcus, he didn't make it, did he?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was an answer in itself. Miller simply nodded, a single tear tracking a path down his wrinkled cheek. "He was always a good man." Miller whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Too good for us." He wiped his face with a gnarled hand and then looked at Caleb, a flicker of the old fire returning to his eyes. "So, what's the plan, Sergeant? We can't run anymore. We have to make a stand." Caleb and Miller stood in the back office of the hardware store, the air thick with unspoken tension. The small, cluttered room, filled with stacks of invoices and the scent of sawdust, was a world away from the Afghan mountains they had once patrolled. Yet, the familiar dread of an impending attack hung as heavy as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Miller, his hands clasped over a worn desk, sighed heavily. The sound was a mix of weariness and acceptance. He was always a step ahead, Miller recalled, his eyes distant, lost in a memory 10 years old. He knew our plays before we made them. He was a perfect hunter. Caleb didn't respond with words, but his eyes, sharp and focused, did the talking. He traced a line on the dusty concrete floor with his boot, a ghost of a tactical map. "He's using our own tactics against us," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He picked up a can of WD-40, his fingers tracing the cold metal. The way he got to Sanchez and Ramirez, he knew their routines, their weaknesses. He's been watching them for a long time. He's patient. Miller nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the front of the store, beyond the closed office door. "He's playing a game, Caleb, and we're the pieces." Suddenly, the store's lights flickered and died. The hum of the fluorescent tubes vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The sudden darkness was absolute, a heavy blanket that swallowed the room and all its familiar objects. Caleb's muscles tensed, his hand instinctively gripping the handle of his hunting knife, a cold, reassuring weight. The familiar, low-level anxiety of a battlefield returned, a cold weight in his stomach, a primal scream of alertness. He moved silently, a shadow within the shadows, positioning himself by the office door, his back against the cool metal of a filing cabinet. Miller, despite his age, moved with a practiced fluidity, his hands finding the familiar shape of a shotgun from a locked cabinet behind the desk. The metallic clink of the cabinet door, followed by the solid chunk-chunk of the pump action, was the only sound. "He's here," Miller whispered, his face grim, his features barely visible in the dim light. "He came for me." A muffled explosion from the front of the store confirmed their fears. It was not a grand Hollywood blast, but a controlled, precise detonation. They heard the sound of shattered glass raining down, followed by the heavy, deliberate thud of footsteps. The asset, a dark, hulking figure with a face obscured by shadow, was inside. He moved with a terrifying grace, a chilling fluidity that was an unholy mix of a trained soldier and a primal predator. He was in their world now, and he was hunting. "Miller!" A deep, distorted voice echoed through the store. It was not human. It was a guttural, synthesized growl, a voice filtered through a modulator, making it sound like a demon speaking through a broken speaker. The voice was filled with a cold, bitter malice, a decade of simmering hatred finally unleashed. "Sergeant Stone, I knew you'd come for your captain." There was a pause, a moment of profound, terrifying silence, before the voice boomed again, a final, chilling promise. "I'm here to finish what you started." The last words were a direct shot at Caleb, a grim reminder of his past and the decision that had haunted him for 10 years. Caleb and Miller, a generation apart but united by a shared past, fought a desperate, silent battle against the dark figure moving through the aisles of the hardware store. The air, once still, was now charged with the kinetic energy of a close-quarters engagement. The store, a labyrinth of shadows and metal shelving, became a battlefield. Caleb, using the skills he had tried to bury, moved with a predator's grace, slipping between pallets of paint and stacks of lumber. His intimate knowledge of the store, a product of his recent conversations with Miller, was his only advantage. Miller, a seasoned tactician, provided cover fire, his shotgun blasts echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space, the sound a percussive assault on the tense silence. Each shot was a point of light, illuminating the store in a blinding, fleeting flash before plunging it back into suffocating darkness. The asset, however, was faster than they remembered, a blur of motion in the darkness. He was a perfect ghost, a master of misdirection and surprise. He dodged Miller's shots with an almost inhuman agility, his eyes glowing faintly, a predatory glint in the dim light. Caleb caught a glimpse of him as he ducked behind a pallet of paint cans, a fleeting image of a twisted grin, a flash of pure malice. He seemed to relish the hunt, a sick, perverted joy in the game of death. He was not just a soldier anymore. He was a monster. "Don't let him separate us," Miller yelled, his voice strained and raw. "He wants us alone." Miller's words were a command, a grim warning. The asset, having learned their tactics, was now trying to break them apart, to isolate his prey and eliminate them one by one. Caleb's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure adrenaline. He saw his chance, a brief opening as the asset moved from behind the paint cans. Caleb lunged, his hunting knife a silent extension of his arm, a blade glinting in the faint moonlight streaming through the shattered window. But the asset was prepared. He was always prepared. He twisted with a fluid, terrifying speed, catching Caleb's arm in a vice-like grip. With a surge of inhuman strength, he slammed Caleb against a shelf of tools. The metal tools clattered to the floor, a deafening cascade of noise that was a stark contrast to the silent brutality of the fight. The asset pinned Caleb against the shelf, his hand wrapped around Caleb's throat. His eyes, cold and merciless, were no longer glowing faintly. They were two burning coals of pure, unadulterated hatred boring into Caleb's soul. "You left me to die, Stone," the asset hissed, his voice a guttural whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest pits of hell. The words, 10 years in the making, were a poison in Caleb's ear. "Now you'll watch your men die one by one, just like I did, and you will be last." He raised a knife, its blade glinting in the faint moonlight, a cold promise of death. Just then, the front door burst open. The sudden sound, a sharp, violent crash, was a jarring intrusion into the silent, intimate cruelty of the moment. A young woman with a shotgun, her face a mix of fear and grim determination, stood in the doorway, framed by the pale moonlight. It was Maya, Miller's daughter, who had come to check on him after the lights went out. The sight of her father and a stranger being held at knife point galvanized her. "Get off him!" she screamed, her voice trembling but firm, a small, courageous sound in the face of a terrifying monster. The asset, momentarily surprised by the new arrival, a variable he had not accounted for, released his grip on Caleb. He took a single, slow step back, his eyes fixed on Maya, assessing her as a new threat, a new piece on his chessboard. He then vanished into the shadows as quickly as he had arrived. He left as a phantom in the night, a silent promise to return. The store was silent once more, the only sound the shallow, desperate gasps of Caleb as he struggled to breathe. Maya, her shotgun now lowered but still clutched tightly in her hands, rushed to Caleb and her father. Miller, his face a mask of shock and awe at his daughter's bravery, looked at Caleb with a newfound sense of purpose. Maya, a former EMT, tended to Caleb's arm, which was bruised and bleeding from the impact with the shelf. She worked with a calm efficiency, her hands steady despite the lingering fear in her eyes. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting between her father and Caleb. Caleb looked at Miller, who simply shook his head, his face a mask of regret. "He was one of us, in a way," Caleb finally said, his voice hoarse, a man still fighting for breath. He told her the truth, a truncated version of the Kandahar mission, the betrayal, and the asset's return. He saw the doubt and fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of resolve. "So you're just going to let him keep hunting you?" she asked, her voice laced with indignation, a challenge to their fatalistic acceptance. "We have to stop him," Caleb said, his voice flat. "But he knows our moves. He knows us. We're at a disadvantage." Miller, his hand resting on Maya's shoulder, looked at Caleb. "You know him best, Caleb. You're the one he fears. You're the only one who can get inside his head. We have to use that." Caleb, his gaze fixed on the broken window, felt the familiar pull of a plan forming. A new plan, with a new ally. "We have to bait him," he said, looking at Maya, "and you're going to help us." The fluorescent lights of Miller's hardware flickered back to life, buzzing with a grating, unsteady hum. The sudden brightness was a harsh, unwelcome contrast to the shadowy brutality of the last few minutes. The store, a place of order and mundane products, was now a scene of utter chaos. Shelves were toppled, paint cans were dented, and a deep, unsettling silence had returned, broken only by the rhythmic gasps of the three people left standing. Maya, her face pale with shock, helped her father and Caleb to their feet. Her hands, still trembling, clutched the shotgun, the cold steel a grounding weight against her fear. Caleb, his body aching from the impact, was still struggling for breath, a deep, burning ache in his throat where the asset's hand had been. His left arm, a canvas of bruised skin, throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. Miller, a mask of shock and awe on his face, simply stared at his daughter, his eyes tracing the line of her determined jaw and the fierce, protective grip on the shotgun. He had seen that look before, in a different life, on a different battlefield. Maya, a former EMT, moved to Caleb, her training kicking in despite her terror. She knelt, her hands surprisingly steady as she examined his arm. She worked with a calm efficiency, her fingers gently prodding the swollen skin, her eyes darting between Caleb and her father. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question a desperate search for a name to put to the terrifying phantom that had just vanished. Caleb, his voice still hoarse, looked at Miller, who simply shook his head, his face a mask of regret. He was no longer just a tired old man. He was a captain, reliving a past he had tried to bury. "He was one of us, in a way," Caleb finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, a man still fighting for breath. He told her the truth, a truncated, cold-hearted version of the Kandahar mission, the betrayal, and the asset's return. He spoke with a soldier's economy, stripping the story of emotion, but the guilt was a tangible thing, a heavy weight in the air between them. He saw the doubt and fear in Maya's eyes, but also, to his surprise, a flicker of resolve. "So you're just going to let him keep hunting you?" she asked, her voice laced with an indignation that Caleb had not expected. Her words weren't just a question, they were a challenge, a rejection of their fatalistic acceptance. "He comes here, tries to kill you, and you're just going to wait for him to do it again?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Maya, truly saw her for the first time. She wasn't just Miller's daughter, she was a woman with a fire he hadn't seen in a long time. "We have to stop him," he said, his voice flat, the words a grim echo of a decision he had made a decade ago. "But he knows our moves. He knows us. We're at a disadvantage." Miller, his hand resting on Maya's shoulder, looked at Caleb. The look was more than just a glance. It was a silent conversation, a passing of the torch. "You know him best, Caleb. You're the one he fears. You're the only one who can get inside his head. We have to use that." Caleb, his gaze fixed on the shattered window, felt the familiar pull of a plan forming. A new plan with a new ally, a new variable he had never accounted for. He saw the fire in Maya's eyes, the strength in her hands, and knew this was their only chance. He turned to Maya, his eyes burning with a silent resolve. "We have to bait him," he said, his voice low and firm, "and you're going to help us." The old pickup truck, a rusty beast of burden, rumbled north through the Washington rain. The rhythm of the windshield wipers was a metronome for the anxiety that filled the cab. Caleb was at the wheel, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead as if expecting a phantom to appear in the rearview mirror. Miller sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the gray, watery landscape, his silence a heavy, oppressive thing. In the back, Maya, clutching a worn first aid kit, was a study in tense concentration. Her EMT training, a source of comfort and purpose in her old life, was now a shield against the sheer terror of their new reality. She was meticulous, double-checking the contents of the kit, her hands a controlled counterpoint to the nervous energy that coursed through her. They were a makeshift team, an old soldier, a tired veteran, and a young woman with a surprising amount of grit. Their destination was a small, remote cabin in the woods outside of Seattle, the home of their last remaining team member, a demolitions expert named Jones. They knew the asset would be coming for him next. The drive was a journey not just in miles, but into the heart of Caleb's past. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, each one a grim lesson in survival. He recalled the asset's strange, almost poetic efficiency, his love for traps, and his uncanny ability to blend into his surroundings. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a master of his domain, a predator who used the terrain as a weapon. When they finally arrived, the cabin was a fortress of paranoia. The yard was a mess of tangled weeds and neglected tools. Jones, a man who once built intricate bombs with a surgeon's precision, was now a trembling wreck. He answered the door with a rifle propped in his hands, his eyes darting to the windows, his face pale and drawn. He looked a decade older than his age, and his hands, once so steady, were now shaking uncontrollably as he poured them coffee. "I feel like I'm being watched," he said, his voice a frantic whisper as he handed Caleb a steaming mug. The coffee sloshed over the rim, a physical manifestation of his fear. "I can feel him out there." Caleb took the mug, his eyes meeting Jones's with a grim, understanding stare. "He's here," Caleb said, his voice low and firm, the words a terrible confirmation of Jones's worst fears. He went to the window, his eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of a disturbance, a broken branch, a misplaced rock, anything. He saw nothing, but he felt it too. The cold, silent echo of a predator waiting in the woods. Miller, ever the general, took charge. His voice, low and commanding, cut through the tension. "Jones, listen to me. We're here to help you. We're going to set a trap. We're going to use this place, your traps, your knowledge, to turn the hunter into the hunted." Jones's eyes, wide with fear, looked at Miller, then at Caleb, then at Maya, a stranger with a shotgun in the corner. He took a long, shaky breath and nodded, a silent surrender to a war he had been fighting alone for too long. The next few hours were a blur of frantic, silent preparation. They were a well-oiled machine, their movements fluid and practiced despite the decade of separation. Caleb, with Jones at his side, worked on the perimeter, setting up a network of booby traps and sensors that would alert them to the asset's presence. He was a master of misdirection, using their own knowledge of the asset's tactics to build a psychological labyrinth of false signals and dead ends. Maya, with her keen observational skills, became their eyes. She moved silently through the cabin, her hands, once so skilled at mending wounds, now expertly installing hidden cameras and tripwires that would give them an early warning. She found a small, almost invisible scorch mark on the back of the cabin, a sign that a device had been there. "He's been here," she whispered to Caleb, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and awe. "He's been watching for a long time." Miller, the general, became their anchor. He was their command center, mapping out escape routes and calculating their odds. He knew the odds were not in their favor. But for the first time in a decade, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were no longer running. They were fighting back. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows through the dense forest, Caleb stood on the porch, his eyes fixed on the tree line. He knew the asset was out there, a silent specter in the darkness. He knew he was watching. He could feel his eyes on him, a cold, unblinking stare, a silent promise of a deadly confrontation to come. Caleb's jaw tightened. He wasn't a hermit anymore. He was a soldier, a hunter, and he was ready for war. The night was cold and moonless, a perfect canvas for a deadly game of cat and mouse. Jones's cabin, now a fortified stronghold, was surrounded by a network of makeshift traps and tripwires. Inside, the air was a thick, stagnant brew of wood smoke, coffee, and the potent, acrid scent of three people's fear. They moved like phantoms in the dim light, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Caleb, his hands wrapped tightly around the cold, familiar steel of his rifle, watched the tree line through a grimy window, his jaw clenched so hard the muscle in his cheek twitched. Miller, his face a grim mask, monitored a thermal scope, its green, ghostly images offering a twisted vision of the world outside. Jones, a nervous wreck, paced a frantic path in the corner, his rifle propped uselessly against the wall. Suddenly, the first tripwire snapped. The sound was a small, almost inaudible pop, but in the suffocating silence of the night, it was as loud as a gunshot. Caleb's eyes snapped to Miller. The captain's face, illuminated by the scope's eerie green glow, was a mask of frustration and grim determination. He saw nothing. The perimeter was silent. "He's toying with us," Miller rasped, his voice a strained whisper. "He knows the traps are there. He's a ghost." A moment later, a second tripwire tripped, this time near the back of the cabin. Maya, her hands clutching a worn first aid kit, was watching a small battery-operated monitor connected to a hidden camera. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and awe, saw a flicker, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Then she heard it, a low, mocking laugh that echoed through the radio they had set up. It was not human. It was a guttural, synthesized growl, a voice filtered through a modulator, making it sound like a demon speaking through a broken speaker. The voice was filled with a cold, bitter malice, a decade of simmering hatred finally unleashed. The asset was playing with them, enjoying the hunt. He knew their every move, their every fear. "He's circling," Miller said, his face grim. He slammed the thermal scope on the table. The plastic on wood sound a jarring, violent interruption to the tense silence. "He's testing us. He wants us to come outside." Caleb, his hands trembling slightly, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He knew the asset's endgame. He wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator. He didn't want to kill them quickly. He wanted to break them first. He wanted to inflict the same psychological terror they had inflicted on him in Kandahar. He remembered the look on the asset's face as they had retreated, the cold, silent promise of vengeance in his eyes. This was his reckoning, a decade in the making. "He's not coming in," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper, a grim prophecy that hung in the air. He turned from the window, his eyes meeting Miller's, a silent conversation passing between them. He gestured to Jones, his face pale and shaking, huddled in the corner. "He's going to light this place up. He's going to watch us burn." Just as he spoke, a series of muffled explosions rocked the cabin. The walls groaned, and the roof caught fire, a roar of flame devouring the old wood. The cabin was a blazing inferno, its small, insulated world suddenly ripped apart by a storm of fire and noise. Maya screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that was quickly swallowed by the roar of the fire. The cabin shook, and Jones, finally galvanized by a terror more profound than his paranoia, began to fire wildly into the walls. "He's been here," Maya said, her voice now a high-pitched cry. "He left a device here. He was watching us the whole time." She pointed to a small, almost invisible wire that led to a scorch mark near a window. The asset hadn't just come for them. He had been here all along, preparing his final act. They were not the hunters. They were the hunted, and they had been lured into a trap of their own making. The cabin was a coffin, a cage of fire, and they were the ghosts trapped inside. They were trapped. They had to go outside, into the darkness, into the arms of the hunter they had tried to snare. They burst out of the burning cabin, choking on smoke and blinded by the glare of the flames. The air was thick with the acrid scent of scorched wood and burnt pine needles, a physical manifestation of their defeat. The heat was an oppressive presence, a raring beast that licked at their clothes and hair as they scrambled into the cold, forgiving darkness of the forest. The asset was there, a dark figure on the tree line, watching them with a cold, triumphant stillness. He didn't fire, didn't move to engage. His posture, a silent tableau of a predator watching its prey escape, was a more profound declaration of victory than any bullet could have been. He simply turned and ran, a silent promise of a final, deadly chase. Caleb, his heart thundering in his chest, a drumbeat of pure adrenaline and rage, gave chase. He was a ghost from his past, and he was hunting a ghost of his own. The hermit of Copper Creek was gone. The soldier, the leader, the man who had buried his guilt for a decade was back. His vision was a tunnel, his focus laser-like, fixed on the retreating shadow of the asset. Every footfall was a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm of time and guilt that separated them. He felt the familiar pull of tactical thought, analyzing the asset's movements, his silent, effortless retreat through the dense underbrush. He wasn't running from them, he was leading them, drawing them deeper into a maze of his own design. Miller, his aging joints protesting with every stride, followed closely behind. His face, illuminated by the red-orange glow of the burning cabin behind them, was a grim mask of pain and sheer will. He clutched his shotgun, a cold, heavy weight in his hands, his eyes darting from side to side, watching for an ambush. He was no longer just the old hardware store owner. He was a captain, and his last remaining soldiers were right beside him. But the soldier's mind was battling with the father's heart. "Maya, stay close," he yelled, his voice strained and raw with exhaustion. "Don't fall behind." Maya, her face a mask of fierce determination, ran with them. Her EMT training had prepared her for chaos, for trauma, but not for this. Not for a battle against a human specter in the darkness. Her medical kit, a symbol of her former life, bounced against her side, a heavy, useless reminder of a world that no longer existed. She stumbled, a root catching her foot, and a sharp, piercing pain shot through her ankle. She gasped, a cry of pain quickly swallowed by the pounding of their footsteps and the whisper of the wind. Caleb, hearing her stumble, didn't turn back. "Run, Maya, run!" he yelled, his voice a hoarse command. He trusted Miller to protect her, to be the anchor in their chaotic escape. He had to stay focused on the asset. He had to end this. They ran through the dense forest, the night a labyrinth of shadows and treacherous roots. Caleb, using every bit of his training, followed the asset's silent trail. He knew his enemy, knew his tactics, and knew his weaknesses. The asset had a unique gait, a slight limp he had developed after the Kandahar mission. Caleb, in his years of solitude, had often recalled this detail, a useless bit of trivia now a matter of life and death. He could hear it now, a subtle, rhythmic thud in the distance. He was not a ghost anymore. He was a man, a man with a physical weakness, a tell. The soldier in Caleb knew this was a gift, a flaw he could exploit. They came to a sudden halt at the edge of a clearing. Before them was a rushing river, a torrent of white water in the darkness, its roar a deafening assault on the tense silence of the forest. The water was black and merciless, a natural barrier, a final defense. The asset was on the other side, his form a dark silhouette against the moonless sky. He turned, and in the faint light cast by the distant flames, they saw his face for the first time. It was a face ravaged by war, by hate, and by years of living in the dark. A latticework of scars, a physical reminder of the fire that had consumed him in Kandahar, crisscrossed his face, making him look like a monster. His eyes, two cold pits of unforgiving darkness, met Caleb's across the raging river. They were eyes Caleb remembered, not with a sense of camaraderie, but with the cold, scientific focus of a target. "You left me to rot, Sergeant," the asset roared across the river, his voice filled with an ancient, bone-deep fury. The words were a bitter, accusatory poison that cut through the roar of the river. "You left me in the fire. Now you'll all burn together." His arm, a thick, muscular limb, came up, and a glint of metal appeared in his hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a detonator. He was not just trapping them, he was preparing to blow the bridge that led to the only way across, a bridge they didn't even know was there. He was going to watch them drown, a final act of revenge, a final, twisted act of vengeance for a decade of silent torment. Caleb stood on the edge of the roaring river, its thunderous growl a metaphor for the storm of his own internal chaos. The cold dread had vanished, replaced by a searing, focused rage. He looked at Miller and Maya, their faces grim, their bodies exhausted and coated in ash. He saw not just a captain and a girl, but the last remnants of a broken unit, a family he had abandoned. He knew this was the end, the final confrontation. The price for his past was due. He looked at the asset across the river, his face a grotesque mask of scar tissue and hatred, a man consumed by the ghost he had become. Caleb knew there was no talking their way out of this. The past had returned, and it wanted blood. This was not a fight to win. It was a debt to be paid. "We can't cross that river," Miller yelled over the roar of the water, his voice a desperate, frantic sound. "It's a death trap." Caleb nodded. He knew the asset was banking on them not being able to cross. He was banking on them being trapped. He was banking on them being afraid. But Caleb had a plan. Not a tactical plan, but a desperate, dangerous, and insane one, born of guilt and a final, brutal sense of duty. "He's got us," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the asset, a silent challenge in their depths. "But he doesn't have me." He turned to Miller and Maya, his face a stoic mask, his voice a low, firm command that cut through the noise of the river. The leader was back. "You two get out of here. Follow the river downstream, away from the bridge. You'll find a logging road. Find help. I'll keep him busy." "Caleb, no!" Maya screamed, her face a mask of panic and disbelief. "You can't do this alone." But Caleb was already moving, stripping off his jacket. He tossed it aside, the last vestige of the hermit, and plunged into the frigid, fast-moving water. The river was a battle of its own, a relentless, icy force that threatened to pull him under. It was a physical manifestation of his own torment, a relentless current of guilt and loss. He fought, every muscle screaming in protest, every breath a gasp. The cold was a sharp, stinging pain, a shock to his system that purged the fear and left only a burning, singular focus. On the other side, the asset watched, his face a mix of disbelief and cold respect. He had planned for everything, but not this. He raised his rifle, aiming at Caleb's struggling form, his twisted smile a grim promise of a final, easy kill. But before he could fire, a shotgun blast echoed through the canyon. The bullet hit the rocks near him, a deafening crack that forced him to take cover. Miller, using a zip line he had rigged in a matter of seconds, descended from a high cliff on the other side, providing cover fire. He was a captain again, a protector. His old bones may have ached, but the fire of a true leader was back in his eyes. Caleb reached the other side, gasping for air, his body numb with cold. He collapsed on the muddy bank for a moment, gathering his strength. He saw the asset, his rifle now discarded, waiting for him. The final confrontation was not with guns, but with their bare hands. He was a monster, but he was a man first, and this was a man's fight. The asset took a step forward, a knife glinting in the faint light. "This ends here, Caleb," he said, his face a portrait of righteous hatred, his voice a guttural whisper. "One of us walks away, the other stays behind, just like you did to me." Caleb, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm, drew his own knife, its blade a cold, familiar extension of his will. He didn't say a word, he just stared, his eyes burning with the last embers of a silent war. The two men, a veteran and a ghost, stood in the darkness, two halves of a broken whole, ready for the final, bloody act. The only sound was the roaring river, the final witness to a confrontation a decade in the making.